Can we all come together here and we'll begin another think tank? Phil, how are you? Hi. Dennis Stoner. Thank you. All right. Thank you for coming out on a fine April day. It's a little cool, but the sun is beautiful, and I encourage you, High Forest, come in. I encourage you to go to the KU Relays after this or sometime, because this is the last time the KU Relays will be in Memorial Stadium. It's a historic relays. We're going to have a new track out on the west side of town, and all of that has just begun to work. So I used to go to the KU Relays when I was a child in the 50s, and I remember all these great runners. So if it weren't for you today here, I'd be down there. So I want to encourage you to think about how important it is to get all sides of the university, and particularly track and field. I think it's great. But that's not our topic today. And our topic, again, is another New Cities think tank, which we have been doing now for 3 years, and we've brought many, many distinguished presenters to this room to talk to us about various aspects of aging and the built environment. And when you get to the built environment doesn't do anything without a social fabric behind it. And in particular, the kind of thing that we are up to with our university intergenerational community, related community, has to do with both CCRCs, which would be not-for-profit portions, and then for-profit portions, which would be more single-family houses for all kinds of different people. So we have special governance complexities in our future. And but governance is always going to be a problem because we're dealing with people and we have to have organization. And in particular, when we're talking about the boomers, they are the generation that doesn't want to be governed, right? They want self-governance. And if they don't get it, then they burn down the college or something like that. That's what happened here in the 60s. There's almost nothing you could happen here that we could get the college to be burned down by any student, it seems. But at least in the 60s, if you remember that, and I was here in the 60s, I remember Bobby Kennedy speaking at Allen Fieldhouse, huge groups of thousands of students and people interested in that. So there was a little pushback. Well, I think we're going to find all kinds of examples of pushbacks as we begin to think about the boomers. A delightful group of people, a very large group of people, and many of you out there either are boomers or you can't avoid them. I try to be self-deprecating a little bit just for fun, but governance is always going to be a very important part of any kind of community that we want to organize for aging in place, whether it's East Side Villages, which really looks at the social fabric, or whether it's the campus village, which really looks at building a new place that engages a social fabric that worked well in the past and has been sort of left off of the scene for quite a while, and that is neighborliness and intergenerational life. But today we have Dr. Lydia Pugh with us, and as well as her colleague Tony Ewert, whom I didn't know was going to present because he sneaked in on me, didn't want a poster. But Lydia has been with the Aging Research Institute, a firm in town, since 2006. And she leads strategic planning, organizational, and leadership governance development initiatives for clients, as well as providing advisory services for marketing and marketing research. She's been in the business quite a long time. She was the Director of Research and Strategic Planning for Spectrum, Inc., and Vice President for Marketing for Asbury Development and Management, Director of Marketing Services for Van Scoyoc. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in liberal arts from Goddard College, an MS in marketing from Johns Hopkins, and an EDD in human and organizational learning from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And she has been very interested in the research of interpersonal dynamics in not-for-profit governance teams, and she has been working with CCRCs since 1978. Come on in, Pam. Welcome. We just keep filling up. So with that, Dr. Pugh, we welcome you to Boomer Futures Think Tank, and we appreciate your coming, and it's all yours.
Very good, thank you. How long are we scheduled to be here?
We're scheduled to talk for maybe about 50 minutes.
Okay.
And then we'll have a discussion, and people will come in and out as they wish. And whenever we're done talking, we're done.
Okay.
Usually we're done by about 1 o'clock, but it may be longer with smaller groups, and however it takes.
I'm not going to worry about it.
Okay.
If you guys all get up and leave, then I'll go home.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. I've been watching some of the other people from ARI, from our firm, have been here and spoke to this group before, maybe not exactly the same people that are here, but we were familiar with this project that KU, of course we have, how many KU graduates? 3? So 2? All right, well, 40% of our firm are KU graduates, there's only 5 of us.
Where is ARI located?
ARI is a virtual company. We have an accounting firm in Lawrence, and that's what we use as our address. But there are 5 of us in the firm. 4 of the firm members are located around Lawrence and Topeka, and I live in Billings, Montana. So we don't have offices, we don't have secretaries, we do everything ourselves, and work pretty much on airplanes and catch up with each other when we get off the airplane. So it's actually it's a great way to work when you've got a little company like ours. It's been very effective. You can tell Dennis isn't a sociologist because he made a statement that whenever you have people together, you have problems. And when I think about governance, the whole subject of governance to me, and getting into this particularly in doctoral work and doing research in governance, came about sort of by accident, because I was working, I had a strong background in marketing, was involved in marketing and market research in this industry for years, 20 years, before I ever really thought about governance very much. And one of the things that we're, as consultants, which is what I do, I'm a consultant, I'm not an academic, I don't teach, I work, well, not like teachers don't work, but I know some of them work very hard. But we work with, our firm, we work with retirement housing and long-term care providers, and a lot of CCRCs. And does everybody here know what that acronym means? Because you're using it casually, and it's a continuing care retirement community, which, not everybody? Okay, continuing care retirement community is, it's a concept that was developed, mainly attributed to the Quakers in Pennsylvania back in, I don't know, the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, 70s, I guess, where they had the idea that to create a community where a senior could move in while they were still active, where they were still able to live independently, and not really change much in their life except their address, with the idea that as time went on and they needed more care, more services, or maybe they didn't, that this was a community that could provide for whatever services they might need. And the idea appealed to people because they wanted to know, if I'm 75 years old and I'm living in my own home, and I want to go to, I want to travel and do some things, have a place to come home to, not take care of the house, home maintenance gets to be a big issue. The other big concern, which a lot of times isn't talked about because we don't like to talk about mortality, and there's a strong psychological bent to the decision to move to a CCRC, which has to do with getting to the point where you can kind of start to look mortality in the eye and say, you know what, I want to plan for the future, and I want to try to take care of as many possible contingencies as I can. And not every human being is capable of making decisions that way, which is why only about 1 in 2 or 3, or 1 in 3 or 4 of every age and income qualified senior in the United States lives in a CCRC. Most people can never make that decision to think that far ahead to give up their home and move into a community that is planned for the rest of their life. It's a huge decision for people to make. For some people, it's the biggest decision they've ever made. So we were doing consulting work, and the only people that hire consultants are the ones who get into trouble. And that's not always the case. But so most of the clients that we were working with were retirement communities that got into trouble. And because my background was in marketing and market research, that was the area that I was spending a lot of my time working on, is going in and look at the market aspect of it, what's happening with competition, and how to design marketing programs, and looking at the market dynamics that might be affecting the success of the organization. But what became troubling to me as I did this over and over and over again was that the rabbit trail of the problems of the organization always went back to the board. Because we could go in and make a presentation, we could tell the organization, these are the things that you need to do to fix this. And sometimes they're really simple things, and nothing would change. And you could blame it on the staff, you could say it's management's fault, but at the end of the day, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the IRS, the board is responsible for the outcomes of that organization, regardless of whether or not they took a vote on the decision or the strategy and course of action that the staff decided to go in. The board is held accountable for that, and we've seen numerous cases in the last 10 years with American University, with the Smithsonian Institution, with the Red Cross, where there has been malfeasance, or at least criticisms of that within the governance of some nonprofit organizations. So the scrutiny of nonprofits has become sort of a much higher profile. So when we talk about, when I saw this happening and I just decided that I was bored with marketing and decided to go back to school and was going to get a PhD in marketing, which I'm really glad I didn't do that, but it wasn't going to solve the questions that I had. And so I looked around at different programs, and this program that GW had, this executive leadership program, gave me the ability to do the kind of research that I wanted to do that could be relevant to the work that I wanted to do. So it was a neat program that combines anthropology, sociology, psychology, adult learning, and management, business management. So it spins all those together and says, okay, now go out and look at the world through that kind of a lens. So that's sort of the view that I come at this with. Is this supposed to?
Either down arrow.
Page down, down arrow.
Be this one.
There's 3 different arrows. This is the title of this presentation, which really has nothing to do with it anymore. When I was first asked to do this, I had an idea about what I was going to talk about, and then I started asking Dennis some questions, and it turned out that really wasn't what I wanted to talk about. But I came up with this. I live in Montana, and my house is out in the country, and there's a train that goes by, and it runs north and south. And a lot of days when the train goes by, it's full of coal. And, you know, car after coal coming out of central Montana. And then, of course, we have the Bakken up there now, too. And so we've got oil and gas coming out in, you know, those oil cars. And then going north, you have one whole train car that will have one piece of one of those giant windmills. So I started thinking about resources, and I thought, well, this would be clever. It has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about. So this is our team. I think you've met David. Jim is here with me. Tony's here. Eric was going to come, but had something else, so he's not here. But he lives in Topeka. David, Tony, and Jim all live in the Kansas City, Lawrence area, and I'm in Montana. But we do a lot of different kinds of work in this industry. How many of you know what the thing on the right is? Come on, it's just a dinosaur. No, the one on the right. Oh, I'm sorry. My right.
Oh.
My right. Right. And I just saw Jurassic Park, the 3D version, which is really cool, even though it's the old movie. It's really cool. They called him a Brachii something or other, so see, everybody here knows. Anybody know what the thing on the left is? In 20 years, no one has ever gotten this right. And I always think when I go to a university, somebody will. It's a Philippine tarsier. There she goes. And they're, okay. Well, they're only about this big. But he can spin his head 180 degrees. There are a lot of interesting characteristics about him. But the difference between these two is that this one's still here, this one's still here, and this one's not. And this one's been here for millions and millions and millions of years and has managed to survive when this one doesn't exist anymore. And when we think about organizations and we think about governance and we think about how most of the nonprofits that have been developed in the United States have been developed since the 50s, but there are some that go way back in the United States. There's some that have been around for a long time. And when you look at the animal kingdom and you look at evolution of species, one of the concepts of that is that the things that have the most impact on whether something survives is its anatomy, its little body and his little toes that stick to the trees, and the fact that his head can spin around 180 degrees. And he's tiny, so he doesn't need a lot of food. Anatomy and behavior, so the choices that the thing makes. And my idea is that governance decisions, when you're starting out an organization where you've got a blank slate, you have the opportunity to do everything perfectly. And as you think about governance, one aspect of governance is that it makes decisions. When people say, well, what does governance do? If nothing else, what's most important to remember about governance is that it's a decision-making machine. That's what it exists for. It can make good decisions, it can make bad decisions, and a lot of times you don't even know if it's a good or bad decision until you're 10, 15 years down the road, because everything changes. But the governance decisions of a nonprofit are going to drive the anatomy and behavior of a nonprofit, just like as you put boards together for the cities project you're thinking about. They're going to start making decisions that are going to affect that. So it's important to keep that in mind, particularly at this stage of development. And this is just a marketing 101 product development slide where in the beginning when you come up with a new product, a cell phone or a microwave, and you say, okay, we're going to put this product on the market, we spent a lot of money developing it, now we're going to hope some people buy it, and then we're going to go up here and we're going to make some money, it's going to be mature, and then all of a sudden people are going to say, wow, that isn't as sexy as the one that's down the street, and you haven't really kept up. And Jamie is here from one of the retirement communities in this area and has been involved for the last few years in what we call an extension strategy. When you get to the point where the product doesn't really work the way it's configured anymore, so you do an extension strategy. You're unique because you're down here. So you're just at the beginning of thinking, what are we going to do? What is this product going to be? Who are we going to serve? What is it going to look like? How are we going to structure it? And again, the stage of development has major implications for governance and how you're going to structure your governance. So, two questions, two kind of framing questions for our talk today. One is, what is governance? When I talk to you about governance, I have a worldview of governance that's different than some people's. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it's just simply where I've come from. But in terms of helping this to be a dialogue for you to understand, that's where I'm coming from. And then what exactly are we talking about governing? Because I think that's part of the question that this group is wrestling with. There's a huge void in empirical research for governance. And when I started to do my dissertation research, which I did, it was called The Invisible Director, the Interpersonal Dynamics of Effective Nonprofit Boards. And when I started looking at the research that was out there, Chait, who's at Harvard, Holland, who's at Georgia, and Taylor, I don't know where she is, they had done the only significant research in the industry and come up with these 6 competencies. So I looked at those and I thought, well, those are kind of boring, but they apply. And even then, when I looked at that, I thought, man, the one that really grabs me is this interpersonal thing. How do these people work together? And so that one sort of stuck with me. And then in 2004, Chait and Taylor and this other guy, Ryan, who's also at Harvard, came up with this tri-modal model of effective governance, which they said there are these 3 modes of governance. They're fiduciary, strategic, and generative. And the generative mode really kind of, if you study these, kind of captures some of those and pull them into one component, which is sense-making and information, and how do you build knowledge, and when you have a group of people that you're doing collective decision making, how do you build that wisdom together? And there's with athletes, is it called tapering, where right before right before you get ready to compete, they want you like right at that point. And that's exactly what we want to do with boards, is that when that vote gets called, that board, everybody on that board has enough information to make a vote and feel confident that they had the information to make the vote, that they have put the time and energy into understanding the issues so that they're prepared to make that decision. So, but there isn't much research out there. So if you go out to study that, I would anybody who you know who's working in this field, it's actually a little intimidating to go out and think about doing research in governance because there is so little. And they use, they lift from the economic theories like agency theory and contingency theory, but they don't take you very far, particularly if you're trying to find something little tiny to do a dissertation on. But this is a definition of governance that I really like, and this is from the Brian Taylor book. He said, "We treat governance and leadership not as separate stories that shape two distinct areas of practice, but as two intertwined plot lines in a much larger story about nonprofit organizations." So when I talk about governance, I'm not talking just about the board. I'm talking about the leadership staff, I'm talking about the structure, I'm talking about the social fabric, as Dennis called it, that there's much more to it than just the board of directors. It's not just when do you have meetings, what's on the agenda, what committees do you have, how big is the board. It really is so much broader than that. So that's where I'm coming from. Even though there's not a lot of research, there are some really interesting ideas of people who have dabbled in this field in research. And one of the most interesting to me is a study that was done by a gal named Miriam Wood. And she's still around, still doing a little bit of writing. I don't know what school she's at. But this, to me, I have seen this happen over and over in every board I've watched. There's a cycle, a board cycle. And you can look her up and find her materials readily available, probably on your university's website or on your university library, the e-resources. But when you think about a board in the very beginning, let's start with an organization that already existed. Okay, let's use Jamie's organization. That'll be fun. When did your organization start?
63.
1963. Okay, and when it started, was it just a bunch of paid people that got together?
It's a group of clergy.
Clergy, founders. So probably what happened, it was probably something like this, that a group of people, their parishioners were saying, we need someplace, we've got these older people in our community, they're having to leave to go other places, we really would like for them to be able to stay here, we don't like the options that are available, they're saying, please do something for us. So these founders start working like dogs, and they raise money, and they go out and look at all these other alternatives, and they have think tanks, just like this. And they start talking about what should we do, what should we do. And they work really, really hard for a couple years to come up with some seed money and come up with a possible site and try to get people to be on the board and try to get people to donate money. And they work really hard as volunteers. And then finally, they hire an architect and they get this thing started, and they're stressed, they don't sleep at night, they're like, what if this thing doesn't make it? And they start marketing. And then all of a sudden it's like, wow, we should hire an executive director, we're finally ready. So they hire an executive director, and the entire board has this collective sigh of relief where they say, oh my gosh, thank God that's over. We can rest staff here now, so let's let them do the job now. We've hired them to do this, let's let them do the job. So for a while that works great. You've got a new staff, they come in, they've got some metrics maybe, they're doing the job, and then all of a sudden you have a crisis, which could be an economic crisis, which we had in 2006 with the housing bubble. We saw a lot of this, where all of a sudden the board is saying if they were depending on investment income and donations to subsidize operations, and all of a sudden both those things disappeared and their operations were laid bare to the world, and what they realized is that their operations weren't supporting their operations, then all of a sudden the board understands that, and they're like, are you kidding? We didn't understand this. We've got to do something. So they fire everybody. And then they go out and they hire the Uber executives. They go out and do a national search, international search, find the best CEO in the universe, the galaxy, to come be at their community. But in the meantime, the board has gone into this position of getting the lawyers, the CPAs, the real estate developers. All of a sudden, their board looks like, Fortune 500 magazine. So they've got this board in there now, and they're super managing. Man, they got this thing under control because their names are on this board, and they're the ones that are going to be held accountable. So they go out and hire the Uber executives, they bring in the superheroes, and all of a sudden, they're butting heads. And the superhero comes in and says, but I'm the one with the cape. You know, I'm the one who has the superpowers. And the board is saying, yeah, but we saved this place. And if it weren't for us, this place wouldn't work. So they've got a little bit of tension, but if you got a good CEO, sometimes they'll leave. They'll say, this is not what I signed on for. If you guys want to run this place and the board wants to be in charge of it, then I don't want to play this game. I'll go someplace. I'll go be a superhero in another retirement community. But usually what happens is the superhero is going to, because the board's going to get tired again. You know, their family's saying you're never home, you're always worrying about this place, you're getting in trouble at work because you're never at your job, you're always over at the retirement community, fighting with the superhero. So why don't you spend a little more time at home? And you get tired. If you've been on nonprofit boards, you know how this cycle goes. So now all of a sudden you've got a corporate board that has backed off and said, all right, and green means that they've pretty much turned the energy back over to the staff. So the staff gets in there, board gets tired, they start ratifying everything, and then what happens is another crisis. So they go through the same cycle. And every retirement community I've been at goes through this. So as you're thinking about putting a board together, because you guys are right here, you have the chance to do this perfectly. Maybe be the only organization that ever has. You have the chance to do this perfectly by setting up as you do go through the founding process, to be aware that this cycle exists and it's real. And it can have a tremendous impact on the outcomes of your organization as you go forward. Legally, we said the board is responsible. I love this song from Travis Tritt, even though I promised you forever, I never knew how hard that would be. And some of these boards that you talk to that are going through these really difficult times, and it resonates with them, because being on a board of a facility that's supposed to last forever can be real challenging when things get tough. And it has been in this industry for quite some time now. So that is the context for moving the organization towards its strategic priorities again. As you're thinking about your board and where you're going to go with your board, not just today, but taking a longer view. All right, what's behind the curtain of great governance? There is some research, some empirical research that says that effective governance does have an impact on the long-term success of the organization. That's sort of intuitive, but there is actually some data that suggests that those two things can be related. If I think about governance as decision-making then, and I start to break this down, then I have to say, well, what do I mean by decision-making? Because I can sit in my house and make a decision about what color to paint the bathroom, but I also have worked in a retirement community where they decided to change the toilet paper in the public restrooms, and the debate that ensued over how are we going to pick the toilet paper, because if we chose some toilet paper, you were going to have to replace all of the winder thing, what are those things called? The dispensers. You were going to have to change the dispensers, and that was going to affect it. And then some people like the toilet paper to come off the top, some people like to come off the bottom, and that was the dispensers. I mean, this is a retirement community with 400. Most of them worked for foreign affairs. They were American diplomats. These were bright people. But I can make the decision. If it were up to me, I knew which I would have chosen, but I couldn't make that decision all by myself. So when we get into collective decision making, it's a whole different ballgame. And in boards, what becomes really critical is how we share information and how we make sense, and how do we structure a board that has the capacity for this, because most boards do not. They have, particularly if they've been operating for a while, you go to the board meeting, it's the same time, it's the same agenda, it's the same stuff, it's the same order of worship at every agenda, instead of stepping back and saying, what are we really doing with this resource of time? And are we making this our first priority? Okay, so when I think about governance, anatomy, and behavior of the little creature, the little tarsier, the three things that kind of make that up are identifying the strategic priorities. As you think about new cities, and you think about the campus village, and you think about the CCRC, the strategic priorities of those, before you even start saying how many board members should we have, what should our committees be, what are your strategic priorities? Because form follows function. You always have to have your strategic priorities identified first and then start deciding, all right, what should our board look like? Don't even do the bylaws until you figure this out, because bylaws, you have federal and state guidelines, they're, well, the codes that you have to follow, but the reality is you can be so creative with those, and people get locked into, they'll go online and find one for the state of Kansas and they'll say, oh, change the name, there are our bylaws. Don't fall into that trap. Things like when you set up your committees and the different categories of board members, because you can be creative. Every board member doesn't have to vote. You can have task forces, and you can have board members, or you can have people, resources that you bring to bear on committees that don't necessarily have to be board members. So there are a lot of ways to bring resources into your governance that don't have to be as linear and as rigid as a lot of people think. The other thing is that from the strategic priorities comes what I call a decision-making agenda. If you take your organizations right now and say, all right, in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, what are the most important decisions that we have to make? The CCRC set of decisions are probably going to be different than the decisions for the entire community, for the campus. Is it campus village? Village campus. Remember, it has capital H.
Campus village.
Campus village, but it's, you don't say village, it's just village. Okay. The strategic priorities and the decision-making agendas, for those two are going to be pretty different. You may have common goals and values and culture in the beginning, but in terms of what the decisions are that each of those groups actually has to make, those are going to be different. So that starts to have some implications for governance structure. And the other piece of this is this whole realm of interpersonal dynamics, particularly power and influence. Who has it? How does it get used? The work that I did using social networking analytics, what the conclusion was is that it's important to have power and influence on a board, and that it's normal to have competence-based influence, where if you have, not everybody on the board is going to be a financial expert. So you are going to have some people on the board who are going to understand how the business model better than other people, but that's no excuse for me to be sitting over in the corner saying I'm going to abdicate all responsibility for financial decisions to these other board members. And when it comes time to vote, I'll just wait a half a second and look at them out of the corner of my eye, and however they vote, that's how I'll vote. That's not responsible boardsmanship. But the interpersonal, but sometimes with a board, you get these people who are so overpowering in their opinions and the way that they're more comfortable with conflict when you get into a board meeting, and they're loud, and so people are like, whoa, I'm not taking them on in front of all these other people. It's just easier to say yes or no. That's an indication of something that's out of balance in the interpersonal dynamics, because what happens then is you get people who are, you're exfoliating the strength of your board, because you're not getting the input from a lot of the people that you ask to be on the board that are important in the first place. And in the social network diagrams that I did, we called them fried eggs, because you would have the yolk of governance would be the key people in the center who had all the power, were making all the decisions, had all the information, and then you had the egg white board members who were not really included. They weren't on the executive committee, and in some cases the executive committee becomes the board and the yolk, and then the egg white people are looking at it thinking, why am I even here? You know, we're not making any decisions. I don't feel like I'm a part of this. So historically, the way we've structured boards can be very isolating for people, and it can create marginalized groups. So as you think about this, take the long view, understand where you're at in this cycle, and figure out how to avoid these steep cliffs of power shifts as you go forward. Where'd that come from?
Oops, where'd it go?
Oh.
And that concludes the presentation.
That's right.
I have my laptop, I can keep talking. What was number 2?
Skate to where the puck is.
Oh, skate to where the puck is. I'll just keep talking. Wayne Gretzky, people said, why are you such a great hockey player? And he said, because I always skate to where the puck is going to be. And it kind of goes back to this whole concept of the decision-making agenda. Do you need to get over here? the whole concept of the decision-making agenda for the board, and that you're always thinking about, not about operations, that's the staff's job, but that the board is looking ahead to where's the puck going to be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and creating a decision-making agenda. It's like a syllabus. When you go into a class, you have a syllabus that says, these are the goals, these are the things you're going to learn, these are your learning objectives, and this is all the work you're going to do to get there. Well, being on a board really shouldn't be that different. That when you come into a board, you have a strategic objectives, you have a decision-making agenda, and then there should be a board development program that follows along and supports, so that when the board decisions get called, and some of these are, you know, hundreds, millions of dollars of decisions that have to be made that will affect the community for years to come. So you have to be willing to invest the resources in board development, and it makes it much more interesting to be on a board when you're on a board that has that kind of a dynamic. Okay, so there's no one best way to structure a board. I already talked about that. You can be creative. You don't have to be limited. Don't expect the board to be able to serve multiple objectives. We have some boards that they want their boards to show up and be strategic and help them figure out the future and look in the crystal ball and figure out the market and figure out the financial and figure out the human resources and participate in all of that, plus evaluate the CEO. And oh, by the way, go raise money in your spare time. It's not realistic to expect strategic. Back in the 60s, before nonprofits today, a retirement community competes with for-profits. And back in the day when nonprofits didn't have any competition, you didn't have to be strategic. You raised money. But the reality today is that a board of a CCRC, of a retirement community that's in a major metropolitan area, you're going to compete. You're going to have competitors, and you're going to have to be able to be strategic and to keep up with. And you know, again, Jamie's organization has been going through a lot of strategic direction changes to make sure that they're ready for the future. And that doesn't happen by accident. So when you're looking at the board, make sure that you're not weighing the board down with too broad of a set of roles and responsibilities. Teach and model transformational leadership versus transactional. Oh, the relationship between the CEO and the board chair is the most important relationship in the entire organization. That's where all of this gets made or broken. I already talked about this, interpersonal dynamics, power and influence are shared, and that trust is competence-based versus we play golf together. So, you know, we're gonna vote together and stick together on this. Invest heavily in information distribution to support strategic decision-making. Treat the board as a living, breathing organism. It's not a structure that can't change. It's a structure that can be flexible and should be dynamic. So many organizations, they have their bylaws, their articles of incorporation, their agendas, their committee structure, and when you suggest, even the mission statements, and you suggest maybe you should change this to something that has some meaning, that's meaningful and relevant today, and there's a resistance to do that. It's as if it's the mission statements particularly, but sometimes mission statements don't convey the intent of the organization anymore. So rallying around the revision of a mission statement can be a way to kick off some of this activity. So we talked about what is governance, and that's really a quick kind of fire hose overview of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about governance. So now we're going to kind of bring this back to a little more specific to your ideas about developing a CCRC and developing the intergenerational. What I took out of the paper that Dennis wrote was a continuing care retirement community within the context of a larger intergenerational community that also must be governed. So what's the relationship between those two? What is the nature of governing a CCRC compared to that of Campus Village? And how might we envision a governance structure for both entities? And to me, this is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the day, for hour, whatever we've got left. This intersection right here is where we want to have the rest of our discussion today. So I've asked Tony if he would talk a little bit about the business model for a CCRC. Not in great length, but we've just got a few slides on that because I think it's really important as you think about, let me go back. As you think about governing this and governing this, and that you want there to be some intersection, you have to understand the business model of the CCRC before you can start to say, all right, how do we define this and what does this look like? And then to say, okay, and then what does the business model for this look like? So we've got some ideas that we're going to show you. And first, I'm going to ask Tony to talk a little bit about the business model for a CCRC.
Good afternoon. It's nice to be here with you again. The CCRC business model, the middle part there, which talks about generating a sustainable resources to fulfill your mission forever. A not-for-profit CCRC really has no exit strategy when they're created. Most CCRCs are charge an entrance fee and then a monthly service fee. So when people move in there, their expectation is that this entrance fee and then my ongoing monthly service fee that I pay is going to basically take care of me for the rest of my life. I can live here, whatever services and needs that I have within the scope or the continuum that's offered here, I will be good. So every time a new contract is signed with a resident, you've just extended your promise another 15 years. And that goes on and on and on. So unless there's a decision at some point by the board to say our mission is completed, let's sell out or let's stop, let somebody else take over, whatever. There really is no exit strategy. And that's one thing for a board to kind of wrap their mind around, that this is kind of a forever type of an organization. Not that they have to be on the board forever, although it would probably feel like that sometimes. Some of the unique features of a CCRC that's different than other not-for-profits, and there's many not-for-profit organizations, and actually each of them is unique. A school board is unique in their own way. A hospital is unique. The city governance is unique in their own way. A CCR is unique in that the population, our customers, if you will, are with us 24/7. So we will see each other, the staff, the board, and the residents who live there, we will see each other at our best and at our fun times. And we're also going to see each other in our challenging times and when we're not so good and we're facing troubles and hardships and those kind of things. And so it almost becomes like a family, and everybody has their expectations when they move in. And so it's not like, I've heard CCRCs described before as a cruise ship on land, a cruise ship that never leaves the port. Well, there's very few people that actually live on a cruise ship. There's very few people who actually go out and dine in a nice restaurant for every meal. So it's different than a resort, or it's those kind of things.
Tony, I changed your top bullet to 2 decades, because we're seeing a lot more of that. People living for over 20 years in our community.
Very good. And that's good. People are coming in a little bit sooner and staying active and staying longer.
That's right.
That third bullet, Dennis mentioned that, residents are not passive participants. I don't know of any CCRCs that have been burned down yet by residents who are rebelling against the governance. But for the last 10 years or so, the whole theme has been resident-directed or member-driven, whatever you call the members of your community. It's member-driven. They have a lot to say about what they do, how they live, because this is their home. They've paid money to do that, and their expectation is that they will have a say in their future. And that's why they're there. They're the kind of people that choose to live in a CCRC. And finally, the business model is a little bit unusual in that you're dealing with a lot of different sectors of business. You're in the hospitality business, you're in the dining business, the property management business, and you're in the healthcare business. And the healthcare business for nursing homes is very highly regulated. It's more regulated than hospitals or any other clinics. It's right behind the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on regulations. And the accounting rules for CCRCs are different than anything else. The way those entrance fees are managed and accounted for are very different. There's always a tension between the financial sustainability and the mission, and that's a good thing. the different quadrants here. I suspect that if in an ideal world, a perfect world, we would always be in this top right quadrant, where everything that we do, every program that we roll out, every offering that we have is highly mission critical and also highly sustainable, that it can stand on its own, doesn't need any subsidy, doesn't need any help or those kind of things. In reality, we're probably, most of the time, if we can get right in here, that's probably a good place to operate.
Those are kind of hard to read. Can you tell us what?
Oh, okay. Top left is high mission impact, low sustainability. And then the bottom would be low mission, low sustainability. So if you're thinking about different programs, then high mission impact and high sustainability. Low mission, but high sustainability. So something, you might be something that's very profitable, but doesn't really have anything to do with your mission. This strategic decision cube is interesting to us as you think about the decisions that the board will make about the programs that will be offered, or in the future the programs that will be altered, or programs that may be discontinued. The frame of reference here is to look at the 3 M's, the contribution to mission, the contribution to margin or money, and contribution to merit. Merit being, is this a program or is this a function or an offering that we are very good at? In fact, are we better than other people around us, better than the competition? And you might also throw marketability in there. Is this something that the market wants? Is this something the market will support and that they find value in? And framing your decisions on the different elements of the community within that framework, and line it up and spend some time to go through the rigorous task of measuring things. And not everything will be in the, again, high mission impact, high margin, and high merit. It really should be high merit most of the time. Some things, though, you want to do this mission critical, it'll need a subsidy. And so it needs to be subsidized by other parts of the community. And so those are decisions that you want to make, and the trade-offs there. You may have, and some of the decisions may lead to being a higher price CCRC or a lower price CCRC, or you might wind up somewhere in the middle depending on all the strategic priorities that you have. And then the issue of cash for a CCRC. Obviously, it's critically important. Most organizations, not-for-profit organizations that have been around for some time, have that bottom layer, the base of this pyramid, which is permanently restricted cash, usually by way of an endowment or bequest or whatever. The donor has said, I want that set aside permanently to be used for this particular purpose. Then there's cash needed for day-to-day operations. And so if you are spending $50,000 a day to operate a CCRC, which is not uncommon, usually as the project is formulated, a banker and a board should want to see about 300 days or almost a year of cash on hand, cash of operations on hand in reserve, so that when a storm comes, you're able to weather a storm and not have to worry about, can we meet payroll? We have to pay our insurance, a big lump sum once a year. We don't want to have to borrow money for that. So you need the cash to weather a storm. Lydia mentioned the housing bubble. That certainly was a storm for the CCRC industry. Other storms that come along is a third-party payment, Medicare, Medicaid. Those elements have been with us for a long, long time, but they change on a regular basis. And they're about to change in probably the most dramatic or material form than it has been in the past number of years. So that perhaps could be considered to be a storm. And then finally, cash needed to act strategically, so when the opportunity comes for a board to start a program, to acquire more land, to do whatever. And I would say to you, as a new organization, it will take some time to get to that top level. That may take 10 years to get to that point where you actually have cash reserves. You will need to have this to be financeable, to be able to borrow money from a local or regional bank or to do a bond underwriting or something like that. And the sources of capital that you have at your disposal are the internal profits. That's your operations expenses, or revenue minus expenses. So it's very important that there always be a margin there. That's where you have the most control over growing the cash. You can borrow money. That's temporary. That has to be paid back, and there's always a limit on how much you can borrow. And of course, the external gifts are great, and as a not-for-profit, that's an opportunity that you have that others do not, and hopefully that will come into play for you at some point. But that's not something you can count on. That's more kind of the gravy or the additional that you can work with. The board should be able to delegate these things to the leadership, the staff, the management, to make sure that the core operations are strong, to make sure that the staffing patterns are strong and reliable, that they've done their homework, and that they've put together a solid operation, internal operation, to meet the needs and the expectations of the residents who live there. To hire the consultants and the staff. The point there, no reason for the board or the management to need to hire consultants that have to learn on the job. There's plenty of experience around now to find good, solid advice from consultants. Rates have to cover their costs before it gives an investment. Capital improvements are predictable, and a plan there should be developed almost from day one to replace your building, because the cost of depreciation on your financial statement is a very real cost. Things do wear out, and you can plan to replace things and not get into that first graph where the decline comes because you haven't set aside money or you haven't replaced and replenished on a regular basis. Strategic priorities for a startup. The project has to be a strong credit, so it will have to be framed in a manner from a financial standpoint to work well in order to even borrow money to begin. And the board should want that as well. You want to have something that looks like this is going to be sustainable. If we follow this particular formula, this project can be sustainable and serve residents for a long time. The second bullet, that is a critical path for the project, the marketing. And you'll learn that as you go, that being able to appeal to the market, meet with their receptivity, and be successful with that will be one of the very key things to the success. And then finally, the agenda, the board's decision agenda that Lydia referred to during development, that's going to be, as she says here, rigorous and complex, but it'll also be fun. And if you think about it as the syllabus for a class as you go in the first of the semester, and there's a syllabus there, the board can do the same thing either through the consultants that you hire that can inform you of these are the key decision points that you will need to make in this next 6-month period, and here's what we need to do to prepare you so that when that vote comes, you're educated and you're ready to make that decision. And that's really the kind of the point there, so you can stay ahead on that decision agenda so it doesn't all of a sudden, this board meeting, we need to make a decision, and you're not ready for it. And there is a future resident of Campus Village.
Okay, so we've talked about governance. What does it mean? What is our definition of it? And then Tony gave you a snapshot of the business model for a CCRC. And the purpose of that is to give you a sense of what the decisions the board of a CCRC are going to have to make. So now we're going to, remember we had the circle, we had the CCRC governance, we had the campus village governance, and sort of where do they intersect. But we're talking about them separately, and then we're really going to come back and throw it to you to think about where that intersection happens and what does that look like. So what about governance for the campus village? Right now, everything that I read about the campus village, the concept, the vision of it, and I've read the paper that Dennis wrote. I looked at the other presentations that you've had by other people. The idea that you want this to be something distinct, something that is that's unique in its ability to provide service for seniors, but also to serve a broader population. That the idea that it be something that, an environment that supports intergenerational interaction. So what about governance for that? Well, first of all, before we could get into that, after I read Dennis's paper, I thought about a place called Reston, Virginia. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with Reston, but it's located right outside of Washington, D.C., about 20 miles from downtown D.C. And Reston was one of the original planned communities where in the beginning, they had 7,400 acres, and when they designed Reston, the idea was that everything was designed ahead of time. Their decision-making agenda was set, but it was done with a master plan. They said, and they said green space came first. They said, this is where the green space is going to go. Everything else has to be built around that. So then they decided that they wanted to have the commercial areas here, residential here. But if you read the organizing documents for Reston, it's 7,400 acres, 60,000 residents now. So scale-wise, it doesn't apply. But that's not what was interesting to me about it. What was interesting is if you start reading the organizing documents from back in the 1960s when Reston was first envisioned, there was a guy named Robert E. Simon, who was a developer who actually, his family sold Carnegie Hall. And when they sold Carnegie Hall, he took the money and bought the 7,400 acres for Reston. So that was the history of it. But in the guiding, they call these guiding principles as he was sort of envisioning Reston, and he said that he wanted people to be able to live in the same community while going through different life cycles with different housing needs as they aged. And it was also very important to them that Reston serve a very broad socioeconomic population. And all of this is available on the Reston websites. This is just some pieces of it, but there's a lot of information about Reston. So in thinking about this and about your organization, I went back and read Robert Simon's 7 goals. And as I was reading these, I thought, where have I read this before? And I thought, this looks like Dennis's treaty that he wrote. And I thought, there's a lot of similarities here. So I thought, well, let me look at how Reston is governed, and maybe there's something we can learn about how Reston is governed that might be helpful for thinking about new cities in the village campus. So went on the website for the Reston Association. The Reston Association is a nonprofit organization. It's a 501c4. And they have 4 governing documents, which include the typical articles of incorporation, nonprofit bylaws, board resolutions, and regulations. But uniquely, they have what's called a deed of dedication, and it defines the rights, responsibilities, and obligations of all Reston Association members and owners of property in terms of how the land and property, both private and common, in Reston are used. RA means Reston Association. Everybody who lives in Reston, whether you rent, whether you own, whether you're a business owner, you are a member of the Reston Association, and you pay dues to the Reston Association. And by virtue of that, you're buying into more than just a place to live. You're buying into a culture that when people complain that there are geese on the lake and that they're pooping all over the edge of the lake, that probably you're not going to be able to bring dogs in and chase them away and hire the geese police to chase them away, because that's not consistent with the culture of Reston. So some people who are opposed to restrictions in some of the organized communities or association covenants, this doesn't appeal to them. But the reality is that Reston today, 40 years later, they have 2 HUD senior housing communities in Reston today. They have a hospital, a fairly large hospital associated with Inova, which is the large metropolitan hospital system there. They have a metro stop now. They've built, they're out by Dulles Airport, and they now have metro rail that can take you into the city and will soon be connected with Dulles Airport. But more importantly, the reason I know about Reston is I lived there for 20 years. So, and I moved there in the mid-'80s. It was right when the Dulles Toll Road opened, and I remember we rode on it the first day that it opened going into the city, and it was 75 cents to go from 20 miles. And we got on the toll road, and I thought, nobody is ever going to use this. It's too expensive. Well, of course, now it's 4 lanes plus the Dulles Access Road. But again, the point of what Reston is today is not the point of all of this. It's the governance structure. And whether this sort of a model for the new communities or for a campus village might make sense for what you're talking about doing, that to create a nonprofit association for the entire community with something like this, with the deed of dedication that defines the intent of this as a community. And then to have, now Reston Association has relationships with the different organizations, like Reston Town Center is a huge commercial development in Reston that has a lot of the chain stores, Gap and Talbot's, and Hyatt Hotel is in there. It's also the home of Arthur Anderson. I don't even know if that's their name anymore. A lot of high-tech companies have built there, but they all have a relationship to the Reston Association, and there are a lot of nonprofits in Reston, but they have different boards. The Reston Association is a separate board. They have a board of directors. And in addition to that, they have a set of committees in the Reston Association. The board committees are sort of what you would think: board planning, planning and evaluation, fiscal committee, legal committee. Those are the board committees. And then in addition to that, they have a group of advisory committees, which are communications, neighborhood advisory, environmental, parks and planning, pedestrian and bicycle, seniors advisory committee, tennis is a big deal in Reston, and transportation advisory committee. So it gives you an idea of how you might envision governance for the village campus, of what that might look like, and then what that relationship might be to the CCRC. And again, all of this is available on
Who decides who's going to be on the board and the committees and stuff?
It's all defined in the, you can go on and you can pull all their documents down, but they have, in their bylaws, it says how board members are chosen. And I didn't go in and read that. I suspect that they vote, that probably all the rest of us. I remember getting ballots when I lived there, and I was not very engaged in my community, but because I was gone I spent most of my time at Dulles Airport. But we would get ballots once in a while for people who were running for the board, for the Reston board. But I think it was a common vote of the Reston Association members that they were nominated, and probably had to get nominated and then were voted in by the members of the association. And they had to meet certain criteria. I'm sure they probably had to live in Reston or have some affiliation with Reston.
But you've been telling us that governing boards have to have a lot of certain characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that get nominated don't often, in my experience, don't have those characteristics.
I know, it's sad.
Sometimes the loudest talkers are the ones that get something, and the deeper thinkers don't.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to figure out how that works.
Well, and that is such a seminal element of governance today, that somehow in the board structure, that you have the formal structure of these are your committees, this is how you're going to set up your agendas, when you're going to have your meetings, but the other side of that really hasn't had, that's more difficult for people to figure out, is the informal structure. And how do you build in time for dialogue? And how do you create a culture where dialogue is acceptable? Where you don't just spend the first half an hour in the meeting going over the financials, which half the people don't understand anyway, and aren't really prepared to ask meaningful questions about them, but they spend a lot of time on it. And usually it's because the staff wants the board to understand, and they want to be transparent, and they want to give you all this information. But then they don't provide, it's just like if you sat down in a physics class and they said, well, here's the textbook, good luck, the test is in 3 months. And a lot of times that's what governance ends up being. You don't create an environment for meaningful dialogue and knowledge building together. And that's what I'm advocating, is that you have to be intentional about that. And so regardless of who you have on the board is not as important as what you do when you have these people on the board. And that you have a culture where it's not appropriate for someone to, and really the board chair, to, if someone is monopolizing the conversation, or is a board chair or committee chair, because a lot of work gets done in committee, you've got chairs of these committees who are very intentional about lifting up those people who might not participate in meaningful ways, or finding ways to be involved. There's the community, the retirement community that I did my doctoral research, the board, or the CEO there spends, she said, half of her time in dialogue with board members. She is very intentional about calling every single one of them on the phone, sometimes having lunch with them, that she spends a lot of time individually outside of board meetings with board members to make sure that they're participating and that they're getting all of the wealth of knowledge and wisdom from the board members that they possibly can. So it's structure. It's not as much about who's on it, but what happens once you get into community together in the board. The last slide that I have is, it's called a Strategic Alliance Continuum, and Girl Scouts actually, there's a publication that the Girl Scouts did where they talked about this. And this is where the question comes up, is what is the appropriate strategic alliance between the governance of CCRC and of Campus Village? And this particular model says that you can have this range of mutual involvement where, oh, this is supposed to be over here, this is supposed to be greater over here, but it moved. That you can have a lesser level of mutual involvement that might look like coordinating or collaborating. At the other end of the spectrum, you have one where it's actually the same corporation, where you unite, you merge, you come together. And so the question that I had that really at this point, and this is the last slide, was to throw back to the group is, where is the appropriate strategic alliance between the governance of the CCRC and Campus Village, keeping in mind that their decision agendas, particularly for the first few years with the CCRC and with the development of the village, their decision agendas are going to be very different, that they're going to have just a little bit of overlap. So as you think about how you structure governance, then what are the implications? And talk about ideas that people have.
Great, let's open it up for any discussion here.
Good.
I think I understand how you're saying it should be set up, and what the relationship is, say, between the executive and the board. What do you do? How do you assure that 15 years from now, it's set up the right way still? Because these places evolve.
Well, and anarchy sets in, and 5 years from now they may change everything. 15 years from now, you don't.
10 years from now. Right?
Well, to some extent, you can't control it. But there's been a lot of things written on this concept of founders syndrome, where the original founders of the organization set the pace, build the culture, and then create torchbearers to carry it forward. And because the board is, if you have a board, a self-perpetuating board, where you've got new board members coming in on a regular basis, you've got term limits, which I'm definitely an advocate of, where you've got new board members coming in over time, but there's always overlap with the existing board members, that's how you create a chain that carries the culture forward. Can you completely control it and ensure it? Absolutely not. But it can work pretty well, and I've seen it work in some organizations that had a strong culture that were, and boy, I'll tell you, it comes back to that relationship between the board chair and the CEO, that there's a relationship of trust, of respect, of really liking each other, but also not a level of intimacy, but but a level of passion for what it is that they're doing together. And every time you have a sitting board, that relationship is the one that I would tend to the most closely. And if you've got a board chair that understands what we're trying to do, that understands this, then that's really where it has to start, and that's how it will be fueled going forward.
So what happens when the board chair, the new board chair doesn't understand?
Well, I wouldn't get a new board chair in that didn't understand it. Yeah, it's really critical, those people that you have in those two positions together, and the relationship between the two of them is really vital. And it's vital in the long run, and it will change and be dynamic. So yes.
Thank you for this really cogent, excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. Do you have some ideas for us about how you keep a community dynamic? One of my thoughts since we began to think about this is we'll have a plan initially, but then the residents will move in. And I would like to have our enterprise not only reflect their vision, but our vision, and also, of course, be strategic in terms of what can be funded. Do you have some hints about how you build in that dynamism?
And when you're talking about the community, are you talking specifically about the retirement community or about the entire community?
The entire community.
I think anytime you have you create community, that it will, by its very nature, create a sense of dynamics that will exist by virtue of who you've brought into that population. But when we talked about these different advisory committees, in the very beginning, it's the dynamics of the community will emerge from where you allocate resources. And I don't mean money necessarily, because money to some extent, but time and energy. So if let's say that you've decided that this is going to be your board committee for the campus village, and then these are going to be your advisory committees. Well, you can tell just by looking at these advisory committees what the priorities are in Reston, Virginia. And these are absolutely exactly, those are their priorities. A lot of it is outdoors. So part of it is you build that into the structure of what are the things that you want to build up to grow in the community in terms of a lot of emphasis on intergenerational activities. Well, then you've got to commit human resources to it, not money, but time. Time and people's ideas and opportunities for people to come together like this and talk about it and continue to be. In fact, I want to get rid of the term strategic planning altogether and start calling it regenerative planning, because really it isn't, we get so focused on how we're going to compete, how are we going to compete, how are we going to compete, but really what's more, can be just as important is how are we regenerating what we are as an organization. And so I think it has to do with resource allocation.
I see your advisory committees then would give a structure to the dynamism.
Exactly,
Great.
and the topics of those, or the areas of focus that you assign to those. Yes?
Do you have any information to share about the consensus building approach and what that could look like in regular board meetings and rules of boards?
The Quakers have a lot of information about that. If you go to kendall.org, Kendall was one of the original, they've got, I don't know how many CCRCs they have, 7, 8, predominantly on the East Coast, Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, one affiliated with Oberlin College. They work very strongly with the consensus approach in governance. And some people, when you talk to some boards about operating by consensus, they'll quit the board because they think that it means that they're going to be spending hours and hours pondering these issues. But in my opinion, the whole concept of educating the board up front, defining a decision-making agenda so that there are no surprises, that the board knows 6 months ahead of time, that in 6 months we have to make a decision whether or not we're going to finance, we're going to vote to go forward with financing for $85 million for this project. All right, if I know that that vote is coming, then I have to be, when we don't have consensus, is a lot of times, or when we can't get to a common solution, it's because we don't all have the same information. I have information over here, you have this piece of information, we're all coming at it with different frames, and in my experience with boards, that most of the time when you can't get to a position of comfort, that everybody feels comfortable moving forward with a decision, consensus, it's because they didn't do the homework ahead of time. They didn't put the time into building collective wisdom in the board, which you have to be proactive about. You can't just decide today, all right, well, we're gonna educate the board. There's so much more to it than that, and it has to be part of the culture. Jamie,
Yes.
you already know all this stuff.
Talk about board size.
Well, 35 is too many. Yes.
2 is too few.
Well, I think legally you gotta have 3. I think Kansas you have to have 3, I think, based on the code. But, you know, it's an interesting question because particularly when you look at, if you think about the board's responsibility, its primary responsibility is to make decisions. How many people can you put together and effectively make collective decisions? There was one group that I worked with in Chicago, and a new CEO had come in. He was the guy that they hired to come in. He was the superhero that they hired, and then they started fighting with him because they didn't want to do it his way, but I think he won. He had a board of 35 people, and I did some consulting work with them to help them restructure their board and reformulate their whole governance milieu of everything that had to do with governance. And what we found when we went in and did some analysis of that board was that there were so many of the board members in a board that size that were marginalized. They weren't in the part of the organization where they felt that they really had much of a role. And there was some resentment about that. What they ended up doing is creating a separate foundation board and then a separate strategic board. But most boards that I see that are pretty effective, somewhere between 10 and 20. A lot of it, I think, just depends on what work, how much work you have to be done, what your committee structure is going to be. You've got to have enough people to populate committees. Although I chaired the governance committee for a big multi-facility in Maryland, the Asbury organization. I chaired their governance committee for a number of years, and we changed the bylaws so that we could have people who were not board members participate in committees. Not as voting members, but just as outside resources, and we could bring them in, under certain conditions. It had to be disclosed, and there had to not be a conflict of interest. But there are different ways to use people as resources. So you've got to have a big enough board to represent differences of opinions, to create meaningful dialogue, and you want some people to bring dissent and to question what the organization's doing. But anyway, I think the answer is 10 to 20.
Lydia, one of the issues that's challenging me is that if we have a not-for-profit and a for-profit entities, these entities come together in a community that's created in such a way that there's a lot of generativity between different age groups, and we have to share landscapes and certain kinds of facilities. It seems that there might be an inherent conflict between the for-profit and the not-for-profit parts of this community. Maybe it's only apparent, maybe it's not real that conflict should occur, but it does seem to me that if we want to be here forever and others want to settle out at a certain point and move on to another project, that I'm still questioning how we're going to get everyone to contribute to what makes the community work when maybe they don't quite own it. Maybe it's a central square or something, and maybe the for-profit is over here and the not-for-profit is here. this is where we zip them together in this intergenerational equation. How do we get them to work together? I mean, I struggle with that because I see the almighty capitalist over here and then the socialist over here, and I think, oh my God, we'll never get this to work. So
it's not unlike what happened in Reston.
okay,
It's not unlike that at all.
Go back one slide.
Go back one slide.
Yeah, right there, yeah.
Reston is, Reston put a lot of their green space in a trust that can't be touched. So that was their first priority in designing that town, because it's a suburb of the Washington, D.C., it's an edge city, and they said that what they really wanted to do is create a community. What their priority wasn't intergenerational interaction, but it was, we want a community where people are outdoors, where people can be outdoors, and so that was their #1 priority. And if your #1 is intergenerational, then that's how you begin. That's where your dialogue starts as you look at you talk about your deed of dedication and how you're going to allocate space. And in Reston, they wanted these water features. But if you look at Reston, you've got, within the context of that, the Reston, or the developer, the for-profit developer, Robert Simon, owned all that land. And what they did in the planning process was to create a sense of community, and some of the land was sold to organizations who were not-for-profits, and they developed the 2 HUD housing communities that are there. They also sold land for commercial, they sold land for real estate development, but it was all planned out ahead of time. And the idea was that form follows function. That if you say that the most important thing for this community is that it be an environment where intergenerational interaction occurs organically and naturally, then first you figure out, well, what does that program look like before you start trying to figure out how to honestly, I think that the organizational structure of that is pretty easy, because, and it's dictated by corporate law. You're going to have and really a nonprofit and a for-profit, idealistically, they don't necessarily have to be on opposite ends of the spectrum. Look at Microsoft and how much money that, the benevolent work that's done by a lot of the major not-for-profit organizations in the United States. So I don't necessarily think that they have to be in alter positions, but in terms of the corporation, in order to get a CCRC financed, you're probably going to have to own the land. So if you've got a developer that wants to control all of the land, then that might be a problem to be able to accomplish what it is that you want to accomplish. And if that's a barrier, then those are the kinds of things that right up front, it shouldn't have to be that complicated when you're talking about developing a community like this. But you do have to have, if you're going to be in partnership with a developer, this whole thing was the developers. This whole thing was the developer's goals. So if you're in partnership with a developer who has the same goals as you do, great. If you're in partnership with a developer who doesn't share your goals, then you got the wrong partner. But this is why Reston worked, because the for-profit, the big capitalist, this is what he wanted to see happen. And he drove it.
well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.